very interesting. There's a lot here that I still haven't unpacked. I was up very late last night, diving deep into the internet.
Welcome to Cult Favorite, the podcast where OM stands for obnoxiously meta. Occasional malapropisms. Observant mycologists. I don't know. The options are endless. I'm Merinda Simmons. If we are obnoxiously meta, we'll try to make the obnoxiousness endearing at least.
I am Mike Altman, often described as obnoxious by a variety of people for a variety of reasons. I guess some of them could be meta. Some of them could just be, I don't know.
Also observant.
Observant.
If not in the world of mycology, in the world...
Mycology?
Yeah, where you like study fungi, you know?
Oh,
forage mushrooms.
That was like
and
the study of me.
Which tells us all we need to know. Go ahead. Who are we, Mike?
We are two religious studies professors trying to understand all of these cult documentaries that you can't stop binge watching. And if you want to support our show and help more people find us, you can follow us on all of the socials at Cult Favorite Pod. Please leave us a rating and a review. Like the ratings, we have the number of ratings we get, it makes us show up in other people's feeds and so people can discover the show more quickly.
So today we're talking about Orgasm, Inc., the story of OneTaste. It's a Netflix documentary.
Yes.
And there is a content warning about sexual assault. If you want to skip this one and come back in a couple of weeks, we get it. What did you know before about the company OneTaste?
I didn't. It's okay. I didn't know. I don't think I know anything. They're one of those companies where you're like, I might have known about this because it looks like so many other companies from that moment in time. Not that dissimilar from Ramah from last time, but I didn't really know anything. I knew that I was looking. I was in charge of finding a documentary, and I wanted one that was short and one episode, like not multiple episodes. It's been a rough start of the year.
Well, and we wanted to make a little detour because part of our conversational purpose is to expand and complicate and ask what kinds of dynamics exist inside the label cult. So for us, you know, there are lots of things, as we have discussed,
and
that probably fit into that category.
And I was intrigued because I know Americans are really bad at talking about sex. And so this seemed like an interesting example of that. What did you know?
I knew that companies like Goop exist and that they cater to ultra wealthy straight white women. But I didn't know that. And I think OneTaste kind of exists inside of that universe. But I didn't know about the company specifically.
Yeah.
Here's your synopsis.
Yes.
So it's just it's a hour and a half film. It's not a series. And it follows Nicole Daedone, who founded OneTaste Urban Retreat Center in San Francisco. The vision was to collapse the dynamics of yoga and meditation and female orgasm. And this was a really profitable triangulation. Some former members within the group allege exploitative practices, however, on the order of financial misdeeds, emotional abuse, sexual coercion, the list goes on. So the film tells, you know, a few of their stories and introduces an ongoing federal investigation into the company. And they do these things by virtue of the practice called OM, which stands for orgasmic meditation. So that's what gets covered. What doesn't get covered, just real quick?
Yeah.
But I do think that it's interesting to note when documentaries do and don't feel the need to consult religious studies scholars and or cult interventionists, because the term cult gets thrown around a lot in this documentary. When and why and how they consult different kinds of voices to tell that story is really interesting to me. And anyway, those are not voices that we hear in this documentary.
Who do you think they should have talked to?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, there are, the options are endless, but I do think that someone who could speak with some sophistication to like corporate sexuality
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the ways that sexual politics exist inside the workplace
Yeah.
is something that I would have liked to hear more about. And again, if you're going to use the word cult, well, then maybe you should also speak to someone who can nuance that term a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
Anyway, that's something that doesn't get discussed. I would have also liked to hear way more about race politics inside of this documentary. We get not many interviewees who are not white.
Maybe one.
Maybe one. Anyway, so there were a few things that didn't come up. Was there anything that you?
There's a whole side quest about Daedone, like post. So both before OneTaste is a thing, and then now after the documentary comes out. Obviously, they couldn't include the part about after the documentary.
Sure.
But we'll get into that. We'll talk about that, I
Okay.
think, a little bit later. That's coming attraction.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's what happens. Nicole Daedone and OneTaste are introduced. The appeal is made clear. She's a confident, aspirational figure for lots of women, especially in their post-30s, especially looking to connect with their bodies in a different way, especially who need to relate to dating in general in a different way. The company emphasizes connection and intimacy between partners by way, again, of what they call OM, orgasmic meditation. So people who felt bad at dating or who were looking for more satisfaction in their own relational lives, those were the people who were drawn in. And they were drawn in at a mighty high price point. So like courses and retreats sold for tens of thousands of dollars. The annual membership was $60,000. I don't know what it is now, but because it's still the company that exists. But it felt empowering. It was women-led. And it integrated sexuality and spirituality in such a way that, like, it brought the former into the mainstream. So all of these, like, journalists were doing news stories about it, and venture capitalists were signing on. But then it was also giving some spice and fun to the latter, Spirituality was made sexy. Sex was brought into a mainstream spirituality. So it was all ostensibly, though, about wellness and empowerment. And that's what helped it appeal to these mainstream things. It got plugged by celebrities, for example.
Well, that's just, Gwyneth Paltrow.
And Khloe Kardashian. So practices inside the group, though, included public demonstration and instruction on helping women achieve orgasm. That would become controversial, of course. Eventually, Daedone establishes the OneTaste Church of Orgasm, and she holds ceremonies and initiation rituals for so-called priests, while women leaders are like goddess figures. So she does take it into increasingly this religious, like utilizing the
and the prices go up as she does that.
Yeah, that's right. So she says that her religion is orgasm. Yeah, well, what she means by that is like she describes it as an underlying something that moves through the world. So it's connected to all of these different things. But she invokes lots of different religious figures and traditions. But these are shown in the documentary in just like rapid fire clips with no context. And I do not say that to justify or give I did not go searching for context. I don't want to rephrase in some kind of way that makes sense of all of her invocations.
Yeah.
It just, the relationship between this corporate entity and its usage of religion is one that we'll dig into. All of this is happening, however, in a demonstrably heteropatriarchal framework that gives women lots of responsibility and no agency. We've talked a little bit about that before. So we hear, for example, about Nicole's, from her own biography, like not biography like a book, but like the stories that she tells about herself. She talks about her dad, who was a pedophile, who used her as bait to lure in young girls. He was later imprisoned on like 60-something counts of child molestation. So yeah, I mean, anyway, she talks about how oming allows her to get free and forgive. That like this situation is this horrific upbringing where she's complicit in harm, but then through the practice of orgasmic meditation, she says that she can kind of just let go of all of that. And by extension, more broadly, she suggests that trauma and rape don't exist,
Yeah.
in this ethos. Because if you're completely turned on and tuned in, to yourself, then you can clear trauma.
Right.
And that there's, her actual words, like nothing to rape. So this kind of mentality meant that women were encouraged and ultimately coerced to engage in sex acts they did not want to have. It also meant that members were subjected to degrading treatment. They were yelled at and insulted, and all toward like killing the ego. We've seen that as a practice too in some of the groups that we've talked about. But this idea of doing things that you don't want to because the places that are hardest for you are where your biggest reward lies is very much part of this ideology. And she suggests that preferences are just unconscious, habituated sets of beliefs. So like,
yeah,
if you are queer, then maybe you should have like straight sex because you're just habituating some kind of repressed.
It never goes the other way.
Mm-hmm. I do know. Men needed to, she suggested, express their beast. Like there was this kind of animalistic, masculine violence that lurks inside of dudes who just need to get it out, and that they repress it with like good guy mentality or performance.
Nice guy syndrome.
Yeah.
Like, you mean being a nice person? That's
so you're probably repressing something. So women needed to respond to that with so when men would like make violent threats or subject women to degrading treatment, Daedone's response to that was like women needed to greet that treatment with grace and acceptance and love. So 2018, a story runs called The Dark Side of the Orgasmic Meditation Company. We hear from the journalist who writes that. But there is a strong response to that story. And, there enters lots of cult rhetoric. And the FBI opens a federal investigation that, to my understanding, at least as of the making of this documentary, it's still ongoing and no formal charges had been brought. But you said that that's complicated, or maybe that there are.
By the end of the documentary, she's like fled. She sells out in 2017, sells her shares of OneTaste, and goes to Italy, and then like Fiji, Bali. So she's back in the United States by 2023, and she is indicted in a very interesting. It's a very short indictment. It is one count of forced labor. Her and Rachel Shevitz.
That's the person in charge of sales, right?
And sort of her enforcer, right? The one who kind of was in charge of all of the coaches and the employees that are, had these terrible things happen to them. And so they're both indicted in 2023 in the summer.
And for forced labor.
For 12 years of forced labor.
Interesting.
The investigation was supposed to be looking into sex trafficking and all this other stuff, but that's all they came up with. It's it's like a 5-page indictment. Relying mostly on testimony of former OneTaste employees and customers.
Right, because we hear stories that are akin to the kinds that we heard in Hillsong regarding working, and for...
Rama.
Yeah. In Rama, like where people are working for the privilege of doing so. Or like with the understanding that they were going to get paid, and then that became kind of...
It's not 100. I mean, it wasn't 100% a pyramid scheme, but it was a thing where you come in as a customer, you become a coach, and then you coach people, and you get a cut, and some of those cuts changed. It seemed,
and some people wanted to become instructors or get inside that employee status so that they wouldn't have to pay for these workshops and retreats that were so expensive.
Yeah. The indictment came down in 2023, and then there was the case was supposed to go to trial this month, and it just was moved to May.
Okay.
And so if we're talking about like what happened after this documentary to sort of wrap this synopsis plus up. So the FBI agent Elliot McGinnis from the Eastern District of New York,
who just issued the indictments,
who was behind the indictments,
okay,
was also the FBI agent in Nexium.
Oh, no kidding!
And has his own Wikipedia page.
Sure.
That was just started this year.
Okay.
By one author. Very interesting. There's a lot here that I still haven't unpacked. I was up very late last night, diving deep into the internet.
Sure.
So, but there's a lot of questions about McGinnis. So he has he has complaints against him when he worked for the NYPD of police brutality, especially around a couple arrests of black men. There are multiple other accusations about him threatening witnesses to get people to testify. In this particular case, and I haven't done these are all alleged, and I have not done enough digging, so this is not in any actionable way I'm telling the story. But in the OneTaste case, there was a document that was literally labeled client lawyer privilege that he got his hands on, and it's unclear whether he got it, whether that was handled correctly, whether he should have had access to it.
Man.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's very interesting that also the fact that he started interviewing people before the documentary came out, after it was in production. Like we see one person talking to the FBI on the phone at one point in the documentary. And so the idea that that Ellen Hewitt, the reporter, and him were somehow in cahoots, because Hewitt, none of her sources were named, and in the actual article that came out in Bloomberg, she had basically combined everyone's statements into kind of general representative stories. Yeah. So there's a bunch of questions about the prosecution. So
the way that this is getting pursued might impinge on the ability to actually prosecute.
Also, things I learned about Nicole Daedone at late last night as I was digging around is and this was not in the documentary. This is what I'm thinking about. At the same time that OneTaste starts, she starts a nonprofit that is focused on people in prison. And when you think about her dad, it makes sense suddenly.
Sure.
Where she basically it's a program that helps incarcerated people approach their incarceration as if it was in a monastery as opposed to a prison.
Interesting.
As a way to find a kind of internal liberation while in prison. It also does a bunch of stuff like setting up sit-down restaurants for the homeless. Like it does all this sort of interesting charity work on the side.
Yeah.
So that's happening literally simultaneously as the whole OneTaste thing.
Does it still exist?
It does, yeah. And then I dug a little deeper. There's a 2009 New York Times article that if you go find it, it's worth a read, because you get the first kind of look at her.
What's it called?
Biography. I'll put a link to it. I found it through Wikipedia links. So that's how I was digging through here. But the what you get in that is that, so she was inspired by a guy named Ray Vetterline, who was a sex guru from the 70s, 80s. I found his old website. He had a thing called, he had what she calls orgasmic meditation. He called it was concentrated orgasm. There's another word for it, but she basically rebranded, and a lot of his stuff is this. He went on these radio shows as
part of the free love era.
But even up until the 90s, he died in a couple, not too long ago.
Okay, it wasn't just a 60s, 70s.
No, it was all the way through. He was on I found podcast episode interviews with him. But he was talking about 3-hour female orgasms and things.
Sure.
There was also a group called the Welcome Consensus, which one of her former OneTaste up was a part of as well, that she, I think, also got some of these ideas from. It closed in 2022. You can find their website on the Wayback Machine, and it is all about clitoral stimulation, female orgasm, etc.
Right.
And then on top of that, she also says she was inspired by something called the Lafayette Morehouse, which was an intentional community that started in the 60s in California. There's a couple Rolling Stone article. It's so
well, and OneTaste, as one of the people does say in the documentary, is a Buddhist concept, right?
So the story that she tells is that she was at one of these sort of meditative Buddhist sex sort of workshops, and a Buddhist monk first performed the what became known as on
Oh.
her,
Oh.
and that's where the OneTaste name came from.
Oh. Because the term
Yeah, it's a famous term in
but has
food.
nothing to do with sex. Like
No.
it's every
No.
like yeah,
It's just a statement that once you have that's in the documentary about the salt in the sea and all that.
exactly.
But she does have a unnamed Buddhist monk in her backstory of all this.
Okay.
Yeah, so all that is to like there's a whole chunk of stuff there that we don't know that much about other than a few reporter interviews with her. And then B, that was not in the documentary.
So what would be interesting then to me is whether an appreciation of all of that context or a knowledge of all of that context, what would that further reify about the things that come up, and what would it complicate? Like what kinds of ideas would it reinforce and perpetuate? What kinds of things would maybe it, put into a more nuanced conversation? I don't know.
I don't know if this answers your question, but like it also
That's a
all
rhetorical
of this happening in this part of the country in California and this part of California, and I think the New York Times piece maybe makes this connection to Esalen and the human potential movement of the 60s and 70s.
Sure.
If you don't know about the Esalen Institute, it is, if you've seen the final episode of Mad Men, it's the place, literally, this is what they're remaking. It is the place Don Draper ends up at the end of Mad Men when he has his meditative moment. There's a great book by Jeff Kripal about Esalen. If you have that context, you can start to see her along the lines of Ram Dass,
like in that trajectory.
Timothy Leary, and taking those ideas, and now it becomes about the popularization, commodification, commercialization of all of that.
Sure.
And we get back to what I find interesting in light of last episode talking about Brahma versus 3HO, you almost have a similar relationship where somebody in the 2010s takes ideas that were popular in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, and then repackages them, Instagramifies them.
And in this case,
and away we go.
And in this case, there is a through line of spiritualizing one's pleasure.
Yes, which was like central to the human potential movement,
for
to what Esalen was doing.
Yeah.
All that,
Leary
Aldous
too,
Huxley,
in
Leary,
relation to drugs. And,
there's my Timothy Leary up there on the shelf. Yeah. So I think
your Timothy Leary what on that? Like
book.
a bobblehead,
It's
a book?
Oh God, I wish.
Sure.
If you're out there and you have a Timothy Leary bobblehead.
Here's what I want to talk about, Mike.
Okay. Sorry. What do you want to talk about?
So along the lines of what you said at the outset, that Americans are terrible about talking about sex. And we should add, of course, like to that Americans are also terrible at creating legislation around sex or at teaching consent and safety and so many other things. But I'm thinking again about the point that came up when we discussed the Jonestown documentary, that like the Jim Joneses of the world never arrive in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Or if they do, it's as a response to a pre-existing vacuum. Like in his case, there was a vacuum of access, to affordable healthcare and housing and food. Jones, sure, like was absolutely a messed up megalomaniac, for sure. But the power he's able to wield, like there are lots of messed up megalomaniacs. The power that he's able to wield as one is made possible by these structural realities that put people in a position of needing what he's offering, right? So, of course, he was appealing. Similarly, I would say, of course, Nicole Daedone seemed to strike a chord for a lot of folks.
Yeah. Because
she brought a conversation about women's pleasure into the mainstream and also involved men in the process. So it wasn't a niche wellness plan for women to do on their own, which is typically the case. That's what that's where a lot of those conversations happen.
Yeah.
And the healthcare system has little, win anything to say about women's sexual health. So it's left to women. And that's only if and after we get to a place of like identifying it as something that can be better in the first place. So that's its own massive societal hurdle to clear.
Yeah.
My point is that like there's a lot of resignation out there because of all of the social stigmas and norms and expectations that get attached to women regarding their sex lives. And so inside of that systemic reality, makes complete sense that this kind of company would do phenomenally well.
If that's true, I mean, I think it is true. I keep thinking that wouldn't there be a company that would like actually do it? Because behind and I don't know, one of the ways that the documentary works is it brings you in thinking women's empowerment, it's that all that stuff, and then you get to like the beast and the men, right? So it starts off with like men are standing here fully clothed using just their hand, right? And women are experiencing all this pleasure to like,
exploitation,
exploitation, etc.
Violence, whatever.
And it's like, well, is there is there not? Is the system? And maybe I'm answering.
Can't
my own
this
question.
happen in good faith or something?
Right? Why can't we just get was it there all along? Like, was it always these two layers?
Here's the thing,
or was it chronologically shifting?
I think it is happening in a lot of. You're skipping ahead really to my takeaway, but
Sorry.
like it's okay. I will save most of that, but like there are lots of really supportive, vital, like wonderful networks of people that are helping women on all sorts of levels. I think that those spaces that are doing good or keeping it inside of the bounds that they originally posture with are necessarily smaller spaces because they are like to remain a safe space. You are necessarily not a corporate for-profit space. Like as soon as you
scale
put
safety.
And as soon as you and I mean the whole concept of safety is its own like super tricky and very complex category. So I don't want to throw it around lightly. I just mean, I guess, to your point about why absolute power corrupts. Absolutely.
Well, also there's like
as soon as you start making profit off of something, well, then
you got to make more. Right.
Yeah, and it also then more, I think, increasingly caters to the bigger superstructure where profit lives, namely heteropatriarchy.
Yes, I think you're right. And like at a very to put some details to the heteropatriarchy, this is all happening in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
And so so all the places one goes for said money are white dudes who also kind of socially and culturally, not to generalize based on
Well, we hear stories about. Are you about to describe tech bros?
Yes, tech bros.
I mean, like we hear from self-described tech bros who really find connection and belonging in OneTaste as men who have been very successful in their business lives, but have never felt like they were relationally empowered or like they just weren't good at dating.
Yeah. And I'm going to plug here. Suzanne Van Goons has a chapter in a book I edited, American Examples, Volume 4, that's supposed to come out soon. Well, that is all about seduction, men's seduction forums and seduction advice and sort of online seduction forums and programs that are kind of the inverse of this. So it's like, here are the ways that so the same guy who opens the documentary, Chris Kolsky, who is ends up being the videographer for the group and all this, who describes himself as like, I was worked in Silicon Valley and I was very awkward around women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So 10 years earlier, early 2000s, late 90s, those dudes are going to these courses or reading these books or subscribing to these listservs that are supposed to give them techniques for seducing women, right?
Gross. This is The Game, right? Neil Strauss's book. Do you know The Game, Penetrating the Secret Society of Pickup Artists? Like this gave us the phenomenon of the pickup artist.
Right.
That book was 2005.
Right.
And
yes,
it's the machismo book that launched 1,000 ships.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and so I think fast forward a few years, and now here, if you're that same guy,
Mhm.
so yes to all the stuff you said about
Mhm.
about women's sexuality and why
Mhm.
women would be attracted to this movement. But fast forward, I don't have to do. I could
I don't
be
have to be one of those dudes.
right.
I can actually also care
Yeah.
about women and yeah, no,
Right.
totally.
And I
Yeah.
can just, and honestly, like I can just, here's a 15-minute practice they're going to teach me. Give me the opportunity to
Yeah.
like, and then I can move into this like
I think some men entered the world of OneTaste with the ethos of trying not to be
right.
exploitative.
Yeah. Yeah. It has an interesting location, I think,
Mhm.
within both like Silicon Valley culture
Sure.
and then the larger wellness
Corporate
movement
profit.
and then corporate profit. Also, this is like the lean in
Layers.
moment
Sure.
and the Me Too moment coming after that.
Sure. Coming after,
That
yeah.
sort of leads to all of this. So
Yeah.
it's a really, I don't know, like I at one point during the documentary I was like, okay, they made in 2017 their revenues was $12 million, which
Mhm.
does not seem like that much money to me comparatively to
Yeah, I
other,
don't know.
like I was trying to look up like what
Yeah,
did Twin
like
Flames
where,
make.
well,
know.
and how much the company is worth now.
Right.
Like I don't know what, like if 12 million was a year's revenue, like what is the company worth? I don't know. We didn't
Right.
really get those numbers, right?
And I was looking at the number of people involved, and it seemed like it was like a smaller number, but also the number of employees was pretty small. So it's like
Mhm.
you have a few sort of golden geese
Mhm.
in OneTaste
Mhm.
that then give a ton of money that is only split a few ways, and so everyone makes profit, even if it's only $12 million revenue. If you only have 4,
We get a very, very small piece of insight from the person who co-founded OneTaste
Mhm.
with
Yeah.
Daedone.
Yeah.
What was his name? I'm forgetting offhand.
Blackman.
Okay.
Yeah, he's the one who comes out of the other group
Yes.
earlier.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, he at one point talks about the business vision as having an like center at every major city in the world. Like it never gets to that point, but they definitely have expansion
Yeah.
on the mind.
Yeah.
The other thing that I wanted to, I mean, I talked about this briefly at the outset, but I do think that this film is a great example of what happens to a cultural narrative when religion, so called, is added to something that is otherwise very mundane. Namely, you know, an arrogant business person creates a highly profitable company that fosters an environment of exploitation on multiple levels. Yeah, huh? Like, and in
Yeah.
other breaking news, the sky is blue.
Right.
So what happens when that case study is rendered religious on some level?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, and I think that there's a similar phenomenon at work with sex, you know, of course, when it gets added to some run-of-the-mill true crime story, it adds salacious intrigue or whatever. But, you know, true crime stories have to have something, because we've been talking about genre, and I mean, the idea of genre has really been on my mind as I approach these documentaries increasingly. And true crime stories tend to need something extra.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like making murder or theft or abuse seem worth paying attention to in the first place.
Yeah.
To make them a story
Mhm.
and not just a terrible thing that happened. But that implicit framing is that these things are not interesting and worth paying attention to in their own right. Like,
Yeah.
which
Yeah,
is
yeah,
the
yeah.
whole problem.
Yeah. Like an exploitative company is just run of the mill.
Yes.
Somehow it has to be both. It has to have religion or sex, or in this case, both.
Then it's not a story.
Right.
Correct. So, you know, treating religion as special and you know, I mean, the cult label as extra exceptional,
Yeah.
I think takes our eye off of the
No.
quotidian ball.
I mean, the phrase sex cult is like immediately there just
Yes.
for attention. And it's all over the coverage of OneTaste from the beginning.
It starts with a pink background and stuff. I mean, the visuals in this film drove me nuts a little bit, and the staging as well. Like, this is how some of these documentaries get to have their cake and eat it too. why are people being interviewed on their beds, Michael?
Okay. Have you seen have you ever seen those Hers commercials? It's like the online place you can get like antidepressants and like sexual wellness drugs prescribed to you really easily.
No, but I don't.
It's on Hulu a lot. Maybe I'm just getting fed these ads.
I don't get a lot of commercials these days, but
good for you.
I don't know.
But they're shot very much the same way, which I thought was really interesting.
Sure.
And like there's like a kind of like I would love to talk to a videographer about like what's this like wellness filter that you're using, like the shots that you said of the woman on her bed, like
and
why?
Later,
why do we need to see her be
ruin his like he's talking over footage of him just lying shirtless in his bed staring out the window, and I'm like, okay, so this is a documentary about the kinds of contexts in which consent can turn into coercion. And you're literally filming people who have agreed to be interviewed on their beds. Yeah. Did they suggest that? Did they say that the place in my house that we should go to have this interview? I tell you what, actually, why don't I just sit on my bed? It'll keep my, like, that's... Yeah. It's not good for your posture. It's not like what? I will
give you an extra layer here. Before the documentary came out in 2022, there was a lawsuit because basically that videographer who's in the documentary gave all of his video to the sold, we should say, his video, all the videos from OneTaste videos he had to the documentary.
So the archive footage that we see is his
okay. That he sold them.
Okay.
And because he shot it, that means he has the copyright, I guess. But there are all sorts of people in that who are not interviewed, who have not been contacted by the producers, the directors. So there was
to give permission to be shown on.
Yes, there was a lawsuit before the documentary came out saying like. So I don't know. I couldn't find.
That makes loads of sense.
Yes, 100%. I couldn't find paywalls were really getting in my way because I don't have a Rolling Stone subscription, so I couldn't figure out how this all. There was a Rolling Stone piece about it. I could not figure out what happened with that, but I think a lot of the blurring and things that happened was because the lawsuit said that the documentary footage was being misappropriated. Like it was meant to be internal to OneTaste people, and now you're taking it and just like putting it as documentary. So there's another layer of like consent questions just in the like production methods.
And so again, it's like exploitation is not our problem. Exploitation with plus cult plus boss babe plus like then it's exploitation in a way that we should pay attention to and call it creepy. And we should that's a company that by all accounts, by most accounts, was engaged in some really shady and abusive practices. So by all means, pull back the curtain on that and take them to court. But in telling the story, there are complicities that we are not that we are not reflexive about, and so we fail to take responsibility for.
Yeah.
And I just think that deserves yet again to be called attention.
And I don't know to what extent, I don't know that I dug so much into Breath of Fire, although there's questions to be asked about a lot of the people in that one. And there's other ones that I've done more or less digging, really because of how much time I had before I had to record. But this one just strikes me as just having so many interesting, production things circling around it. Like the FBI agent and the reporter. Lena Dunham is an executive producer. The writer.
I didn't see that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
The person credited as the writer of the documentary wrote 20 episodes of Girls.
Huh.
So there's there's a lot. The lack of going, if it's on Wikipedia and in New York Times articles and not showing up in a 10-minute bio on Nicole Daedone at the beginning of the film, why are we, what are we doing here? So I don't have a lot of answers, but there's just a lot. I have a massive, as you would say, a massive side eye to the production of this documentary.
Yeah. Was there anything that you wanted to talk about that
I will say the one thing that struck me as I was reading your notes about this, and I just sort of put a note to remind myself, it's like when you get down to the whole men are inherently predatory and women have to somehow make space and grace for that.
Yep.
Like that's every evangelical marriage conference ever.
Let's not say ever, but we find that as a common theme. That is fair to say, perhaps, right? Because we want to make space for nuance. We do not want to be guilty of the same universal generalizations.
Every evangelical marriage conference I've been aware of.
Okay, there we go.
Or encountered in any way.
Sure.
Professionally or personally. No, but that's the thing. Like, it's like...
I have a productive remove.
I mean, if you... Building one. Sure. If you like, I've referenced Jason Kirk's "Hell Is a World Without You" book, which is told from the perspective of a teenage boy.
And it's a novel, right?
It's a novel,
yeah. Okay,
yeah. The protagonist is a teenage boy in circa 2000 American evangelicalism. But it is one of the central tensions of the book is this boy coming of age and figuring out sex while being told that there is a horrible monster inside of him, but it's not actually his job to do anything about it,
right?
It's and like the scene opens, like the book opens with this sort of like spiral of desire and guilt and blame around like a girl who's like wearing a tank top or something.
Right, so he has the agency and she has the responsibility,
right? And then and so the book follows that all the way through in a really interesting way, and I think it's. So it was that was the other thing that struck me. It's like for all the like spirituality, like Silicon Valley, California, like
sure,
it ends up in the same place that the same kind of like really, I think, Victorian modes of understanding gender and sex that's most of American conservative Christianity ends up in.
I'm going to give my takeaway first because I feel like you just segued right into it.
Sure.
So yeah, so if something called feminism or empowerment or connection, belonging, whatever, is forged in the fires of heteropatriarchy, like it's probably, gonna take a different shape that might not be called feminist or empowering or whatever. Similarly, if something called cult is forged in the fires of mainstream religion, that's going to affect the shape that category takes.
Right.
And if religion is forged in the fires of global capitalism, et cetera, and so on and so on and so on, like the context in which something arrives and gets announced as special in what, for good or ill, it is necessarily going to take on the characteristics of its context. It cannot not.
That's very close to my takeaway, which, I keep coming back to this phrase, like the real cult is capitalism. Because
sure.
There is.
Can I rephrase it? Because I get what you're saying, but I don't like how you phrase it. So can we say, perhaps, would you be on board with something called cult is necessarily inflected by capitalism? That sounds like an academic. But
yeah, you can't put that on a t-shirt.
The real cult is capitalism. It's like
because at bottom, almost every time, and maybe it's just the particular examples we're looking at, but when we're thinking about these sort of, especially the post 2000 ones, we're looking at bottom issues of labor, value, and time.
Sure.
That are organized according to the scripts of capitalism. And it is, if we get to like the why of so many of these things, it all comes back to like a logic of capitalism, whether we're talking about Hillsong or whether we're talking about, which is supposedly a nonprofit, like Hillsong ain't got to pay taxes, or Scientology,
sure.
or OneTaste.
Well, I guess my thing is it was capitalism all along. it was also misogyny all along. Like, that's the thing.
Yes.
Like, all of
Yes.
these, the story has
Mhm.
to have something that makes it seem worth telling. A story that just says capitalism is exploitative.
Yeah.
Like, but we don't, but we aren't ready to question our, at least mainstream and
Mhm.
in the way that streaming services work and yada yada. Like, are these the viewing demographics for these stories are not ready, I would suggest, to take to take responsibility for our own complicity
Mhm.
in the
Yeah.
very structures that
Yeah.
thus need something extra to make them a story worth telling.
Right.
And so they need sex abuse, or
Right.
they need, labor exploitation, or they need, because abuse and exploitation are things that we want to remove from these totally basic and ubiquitous framings of capitalism and
Mhm.
patriarchy. And,
Yeah. One of the things a few years ago when I started reading more in prison and police abolition
mhm,
literature, and I knew it, like I knew it academically, but it kind of came through more forcefully in the way these books were writing, is like there is no capitalism that is not always already racial capitalism
correct.
because of a variety of things in history.
Yeah.
And I think one other way to phrase what you're saying is like there is no capitalism that is not always already a patriarchal heteronormative capitalism.
Correct.
And so
And thus exploitative.
right. And so like these moments like One Taste are moments where we finally make evident the mark of that patriarchy and heteronormativity. If that's the sugar that gets us to this thing, then to the understanding of capitalism, at least maybe we can like get people that next step to it's just capitalism. Like capitalism carries with it all of these things
It's back
already.
to, as ever, that, refrain that we have within the field of making the strange familiar and the
Yeah.
familiar strange. Like, this is an exercise, as I see it, in making the strange familiar. All of these stories are only stories to tell if there is something rendered strange about them, something that registers for
Yeah.
people as strange. The question then becomes how and where and why we see something as strange in one context that in a different context is just, called Tuesday or whatever.
Mhm. The documentary ends in this weird way where there's the usual go-to "it could happen to you" message. Like
Mhm.
we're not idiots. We were just looking for a community, and but like
Well,
which I'm
sure.
very sympathetic to.
Mhm.
Yes, it could happen to any of us
Mhm.
because we are all subject to
We're
capitalism.
all being manipulated all the time. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well,
Everybody's
and I would say not even manipulation is its own kind of like funny term, because we are being manufactured. Like manipulated suggests that there's something
Yeah.
pure that's getting
Yeah.
twisted. And I would say that we are getting, like, produced inside of these spaces.
Everybody is a mark for something. And it also ends with a message of like, wow, we thought that a woman-led company would avoid all the pitfalls of et cetera, et cetera. The idea of like, why even a woman-led company can't avoid,
Mhm.
abuse. Like, I feel like that's where I find the most sort of frustrating, and the lack of having one other person besides the one, like there's only the one journalist who wrote the story.
Well, it's the proto-feminist logic of like representation
Right.
is in its own right equity.
Right. And
Like, there are lots of women working inside of government offices to systematically strip women
Yeah.
of our reproductive rights,
Yeah.
etc.
Some of those
So,
offices are in
like,
our state.
you know what I mean? Like, I don't. It's again, it's if those women-led companies are, again, forged in the fires of a
Right.
broader patriarchal capitalist structure, well, then they're going to be those
Yeah.
things.
And I think, I guess I would love one time for a documentary to recognize that it's not like to recognize that.
Yeah.
Like to me, that's the moment. That's the thing.
Like representation is great.
Yeah.
But it's one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
And I think we get some voices in others, and not around the question of like gender and representation, but I think there are moments in other things we've watched where there's a voice that comes in at the end and says like, we thought that this seemed like it would work or be better because of X or Y, but not because of, and points to some. I mean, we see this in Brady Hill, I think, especially. Sure. I think you see it a little bit in Lulu Rich with the critique of sort of pyramid schemes in general and the structures that say that. You see it some. I mean, I think Alex Gibney does a good job of this in the Scientology one because he's talking about the structures that allow the finances of Scientology to grow. But I think, and not and go back and listen if you want to hear our criticisms of those. So part of me thinks that like one of the things that we get to do is provide that voice in these situations. And so I am actually like, there's a moment where I was like, this is, part of what we're doing here is more than just the journey of seeing what we can make of these objects that fall into our laps through our computer screen. Whatever,
sure.
But it is a chance to be like, to add that epilogue that when it is missing and to mark it when it's there.
Well, yeah, because I mean, we shouldn't put, I don't think, like we're always being sold to all the time. So I don't think that responsibility, sans agency, should be placed either on the shoulders of the people who join these groups at all. Like they're just successfully sold a thing.
Yeah.
Like that's not because their skirts were too short, so to speak.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Like I don't think that it's on them to like, great if you can see the larger structural apparatus that contains these things. But I think it deserves being said that there's a degree to which in a kind of general schema, and the reason why these documentaries need to have that place of like, and it could happen to anybody, is because the impulse is to believe that they are responsible for their own, really what ends up being just consumer habits.
Yeah.
Like that you are responsible for, and that if you whatever, buy something, that you should do all of the research to know where it comes from and who makes it. And like, yeah, that'd be great. But who does that on the regular all the time about everything that they buy?
100%. Like I was trying to find out, because they don't say when Nicole Daedone's book came out, and which is also not the only book named Slow Sex, which is a little frustrating when you're trying to find it. But on Amazon, which is where you go, of course, when you type in any book title, right? What?
Oh, the thing that comes up first. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just general response to.
If we're doing structural analysis, maybe it'll stop being the first place that we go to look up books.
No, I typed it into the.
But yeah, it's the first thing that pops up on Google. I typed it
into Ecosia, which is that browser that helps plant trees, but never finds anything. Okay. So then I hit the go to Google from there.
Interesting.
So that I feel like I've bathed myself in some sort of.
You have plausible deniability.
Yeah, I did the best I could, and now it's not coming up. But when I did this the other night, you go to the bottom of the page and it suggests other books, and I can't remember what they were, but they were books from sex therapists that I find I'm very well respected. Like they were like not running a sex cult, but to your point, like when you said that, it made me think like, okay, any consumer who's like, I'm assuming it works in the reverse, that if you're looking at like Come As You Are or something,
they have to sift through
that,
like
it's like often bought with. Right. And so
Come As You Are is a book by Emily Nagoski, who is a sex therapist and researcher who is well respected inside of scientific communities.
Yes.
As well as wellness communities.
That was one of the books that was like also bought with. And I'm like, these two things
are not the same.
Right.
Right.
But it is, like you said, I'm not going to get mad at somebody for not being able to know the difference.
To tell the difference. Exactly. Right? Exactly. And so, and the spaces that put, like the structures that put those two things side by side are way bigger than Nicole Daedone.
Oh, 100%.
And way bigger than OneTaste. And so, again, it's not that we shouldn't tell the stories of these groups and organizations. It is to say that we should also be telling, in order to tell those stories, we should tell a story about the context in which they become profitable phenomena that appeal to people.
Yeah.
Anyway, so along those lines, my cult favorite is an oldie but a goodie. If you have not read Audre Lorde's essay, Uses of the Erotic is Power, you definitely should. It was included in her 1984 book, Sister Outsider, which is a collection of essays and speeches. Audre Lorde was a poet and essayist we lost far too soon. And she places, like, inside of her, because she's a Black queer feminist writer who places the erotic inside of an intersectional framework of power. And what that means is that it is inextricably linked then to other dynamics of age and class and race and so on. So I highly recommend that essay if you have never come across it. But then more recently in 2019, Adrienne Marie Brown's Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, that book is an attempt to, like, carry forward Lorde's approach in the Me Too era. It includes the
essay,
uses of the erotic. Yeah. So if we have time, you can cut this later. But I wanted to read the famous quote from, or like the oft-cited, academo famous quote from Audre Lorde's essay, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, also published in Sister Outsider, because I think that it is a perfect encapsulation of these dynamics that we're talking about. She says, "Those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It's learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support." And I think part of the issue with OneTaste is that it was rendering feminism and female pleasure from within an overarching framework of, this heteropatriarchal space that is their only source of support.
I mean, that's the answer to the way back at the beginning of this conversation, the question about, like, why couldn't my question about, like, why couldn't there be a $12 million thing that did it right?
It's the $12 million is the part, is the problem.
Yeah, 100%.
Like, they do exist. They're just not going to be as broadly profitable because they're doing it on a local level.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And that Brown book's great.
What's your cult favorite?
I'm so embarrassed now. My cult favorite is so dumb.
Well, no, I just try to. I just like a theme. I just like a theme.
Yeah, I know, but this is another, like.
So I try to find things that are.
This is another thing where you bring something smart and I bring something so stupid.
Well, it's a good thing we're not competing then.
It's true.
Good thing we're collaborating.
That's right. Thank you. If I'm falling into
capitalist
patriarchy again.
Exactly.
So this comes out. So last week, we're recording this on the January 29th. So last week on the 22nd, Ed Wisgoski, a pro wrestler, died at the age of 80. Okay. Wisgoski was he wrestled under a number of names and gimmicks and characters, and he wrestled in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, but mostly 70s and 80s, which was like the territory era. There wasn't the WWF wasn't a big national thing yet, WWE, and so it was all very regionalized. And he was a very good wrestler, and he had settled in the Oregon territory right around the same time that the Rajneeshis were settling in the Oregon territory their own way.
Okay, sure.
So I had heard a rundown of his life, a sort of audio obituary of him on a podcast I was listening to, and I was like, and they just sort of went right past this. So I then deep dived in. he, in the mid 80s, early to mid 80s, he decided to come back to Oregon under the character Mega Maharishi Ahmed, as in Mega Maharishi, I'm Ed. Told you it's very stupid.
Perfect. Sure.
And he came in. He's like, if you Google
good man.
Mega Maharishi Ahmed
Mhm.
into the YouTube, you will get all these videos. He's this, like, he was a former football player. He's like 6'3", 280 pounds, 250 pounds, blonde hair and a beard, and then crimson red robes and a hat and the whole 9 yards. And he would ask, he was a bad guy, obviously. He was a heel. And as he went to the ring, he would ask fans for donations. This is from his obituary, one of his obituaries. The Mega Maharishi gimmick was all Wisconsin, based on the Rajneeshis cult in Oregon. He would ask fans for donations to the cause, like any good cult leader, and people would throw money. Mega Maharishi would make the referee pick it up. The money was all his, but, quote, $10 or $15 was a good haul, he recalled. Adding that he would share the wealth a bit and cut in local promoter Sandy Barr and the other helpers.
Okay.
He even had, this is my favorite part, he even had one fan that would send him $20 in the mail every week. The first time she wrote a letter, she said, I'm not doing so well, so I decided to cast some of my bread on your waters, he added. So, it didn't make any sense outside of Oregon. But it was very, very much over at Oregon.
I love it.
And I discovered this. It is so dumb. Anyways. Thanks for listening, y'all. Thanks for listening to Cult Favorite. Subscribe to the podcast. Leave us a rating and review. Find us on social media. Special thanks to the Department of Religious Studies. Special thanks to particularly the MA program in the Department of Religious Studies. And we'll see y'all in 2 weeks.